body departed nearly 100 years ago, yet the soft tissue still remains elastic. No chemicals, no refrigeration, no embalming techniques. Science came with microscopes and notebooks. But when it left behind only two words: impossible. There are deaths that carry no scent of farewell, no crying, no rush, only a final breath, fading quietly into space like a wisp of incense smoke. They say death is a dissolution, a return to soil and dust, a body no longer able to hold the shape of one who lived. But somewhere in this world, there are those who left life behind, yet their bodies remain seated in stillness. No need for explanation, no need for sermon, only presence lasting through the centuries. Let me tell you of these undying bodies, these incorruptible monks, not preserved by human effort, but perhaps because their lives were too complete to vanish in haste. They are not immortal because they live on, but because their presence never quite left. Like seeds of faith planted deep in the hearts of those who once bowed before them. Some call it a miracle. Others call it deception. But to me, they don't need to be explained. They only need to be listened to, like a small bell ringing gently in the quiet of late afternoon. There was a time long ago when I visited an old temple in the north of Vietnam. Chuado Yafuk village, tucked along a quiet river, not far from Hanoi, but somehow beyond the reach of time. That day it rained softly. The earth was damp and fragrant. The path was empty, but inside me stillness settled. The caretaker was an elderly man, silver hair, narrow shoulders, but eyes that still shone. He said little. He simply opened a wooden door to the left and invited me into a small shrine. There, I met him, a Zen master who had passed away over 300 years ago, yet still sat there, in candlelight and the faint scent of incense. He sat in full lotus, eyes gently closed, as if listening to something deep within. His hands formed a mudra at his lap. His body, not decayed, not shattered, but dried like old wood, still carrying the form of life. His name was Master Vukakmin. He left behind no sutras, no grand temple halls, only a life of silence and a body that never faded away. The villagers say that before his passing, he called his disciples to gather. His gaze remained soft, his voice steady, just like any other day. But this time, he spoke the most important words. "My time has come," he said. "No need to worry, no need to be sad." Then he gave them a final instruction, simple, clear, without ornament. "When the sound of the wooden gong stops, that is when I have passed. After that, do not open the door right away. Let me sit in stillness in this retreat for 100 days. If, when the time is up, you open the door and find that my body has decayed with the scent of death, then bury me like anyone else. But if there is no odor, or if a fragrance lingers, then paint over me with lacquer and keep this body, not for worship, not to make me into anything strange, just to keep as a reminder of this path we walk." That was all he said. No plea to be remembered, no desire to become a miracle, only the truth. Letting nature decide and accepting whatever came. After speaking, he entered the retreat, closed the door, sat down in meditation, hands gently folded, fingers forming the seal of stillness. His eyes closed, light as petals at dusk. His breath slowed and slowed again until it stopped. From outside, there was no sound of struggle, no sorrow, no visible end. Only the gong still echoing steadily. Time passed slowly. Not just the waiting of the body, but the waiting of the heart. A lesson in patience, a lesson in faith. Some say that sound did not come from this world, that it was the echo of meditation itself, still ringing even after breath had left. Others believe It was the disciples' own heart, still hearing their master in the silence within. That was the story of the 100 days after Master Vu Kak Min's final sitting. Years later, when his body was moved to a shrine of its own, people came to see him. Some would weep without knowing why. Others stood in long silence, then stepped outside, as if they had just crossed into another realm. For me, it wasn't a corpse kept from decay. It was a man who had never really left. Many years later, I returned to the temple. The old caretaker had passed, but the master's body was still there. The light had changed. The wood had aged. The incense had long since burned out. But that sitting figure was exactly as I first saw him. Slowly I lit a single stick of incense. I bowed in silence and stepped outside, as if my heart, too, had just crossed into another world. Sometimes I still hear people speak of such things from faraway lands. They say, on a small island temple in Koh Samui, Thailand, there is a monk still sitting in meditation, eyes gently closed, back straight, still as if he had never left. He passed away while meditating, and ever since, his body has remained, resting behind glass, bathed in midday light and the hurried footsteps of passing visitors. But what stays with me most is the pair of sunglasses placed over his eyes, not for ornament, not for ritual, simply because the sunlight there is too harsh, and they feared that the brightness might harm his eyes, even though he no longer sees. It sounds irrational, but perhaps it is that very irrationality that moved me most. A body that does not decay, and a pair of glasses, as if to say, some lives continue to be present even when no heartbeat remains. I have not been there myself, and I cannot say for certain that everything I've heard is true. But sometimes faith doesn't need proof. It only needs a moment of stillness for something gentle to pass quietly through the heart. And that was the second time I came to understand that life doesn't always have to go on to become immortal. I used to think such things could only happen in the thick scent of incense in places like Vietnam, Thailand, or Tibet. But then someone told me about a monastery in Buryatia in the south of Russia. There, winters are long and silent. Winds sweep through snow-covered forests like whispers that never end. There lived a lama. His name was Dashi Dorjo Itigilov. He was not a legend, not a character from folklore, but a real person recorded in the history of Russian Buddhism. Before he left this life, he told his disciples, "Do not open the coffin too soon. Wait 30 years. If my body has decayed, bury it like all others. But if not, keep it as a quiet reminder of the path." They say, in 1955, after 28 years, his disciples began to recall his words. So they waited until the full 30 years had passed and then dared to open the lid. Inside, he was still there, still seated in meditation, his robe gently draped over his frame, and his body showed no signs of decay. The skin was still soft. The joints still moved. There was no warmth, but the posture still held a quiet vitality. Word of this spread through the Buddhist community, but only within the monastery. They made no spectacle. They did not turn his body into something strange. They simply closed the coffin again. For many years after that, the monks continued to care for him, as if he had never left. It wasn't until 2002 that a team of specialists was invited. They examined him. They took measurements. And they concluded his body had never been embalmed. No chemicals, no freezing, no technique to preserve or stop decay. Only silence, a stillness that science could not explain. I do not know if any of those experts felt anything as they stood before his body, or if they only saw it as a specimen. But for me, if I were standing there, I think I wouldn't say a word. Just quietly look up and ask myself what could hold a body together beyond time? Perhaps it wasn't technique, not the environment, but a will that never faded. And while I still do not know the answer, I heard one more story, stranger, softer, from somewhere high along the Himalayas. People often believe that for a body to remain, there must be something powerful holding it back, a fierce will, a declaration to the world. But Tibet tells a different story. There, some enter death without a sound. No one knows the exact moment they passed. Only that they sat down one final time and never stood up again. I once heard a story of such a hermit. His name has long been swept away by the winds of the highlands. No one remembers it clearly. Only that, near the cliffs just below a mountain's peak, there is a small cave, barely enough for one person to sit. One winter's day, he entered that cave, carried with him a flask of water and a pouch of incense. Then he sat down. No one ever saw him leave. Years later, when a group of pilgrims passed by, they discovered the body of a monk, still in meditation, still seated as if gently resting with eyes closed. No one touched him. No one dared. They simply placed a small pine branch at the entrance of the cave and quietly walked away. There are other stories too. At another monastery, each morning a cup of tea is placed before a seat that has been empty for over half a century. Not out of habit, but out of a gentle faith that some beings remain even after leaving their bodies behind. A pair of old sandals still rest neatly by the meditation hall door. No one moves them, because the one who last wore them never truly left. No announcements, no scientific tests. No one measured tissue elasticity. No one asked, is this incorruptibility? Only one thing remains, a quiet sense of presence, whether the body is there or not. And now, perhaps you'll ask me, what makes someone remain after they've already gone? I don't know the answer. And I think I don't need to, because sometimes the most precious thing is not how much we understand, but how long we've been silent enough to listen to something that no longer needs words. But not everyone waits for a miracle. Some step into dissolution by their own will. They turn their bodies into a lesson for the living, with a vow not to be immortal, but to remind the world, do not forget death. There are things that after hearing, I cannot say anything more. Not because I don't understand, but because my heart is still listening. Like when stepping out from a silent sanctuary, I cannot immediately walk into the noisy world outside. A pause is needed, a breath. Not to forget the story just told, but to settle so that what comes next may be received with a gentler heart. After leaving those stories behind, I suddenly asked myself, could it be that someone once entered death not as a departure, but as a journey? Not because of age, not because of illness, but because of a deeper vow to leave something for those who remain. I once read a thin fragment of writing, ink faded, the paper yellowed with time. The author was an anonymous monk who left behind no name, only a few lines about his old master. My master once said, "This body is but a fragile garment. If one wishes his teaching to endure, he must entrust even his body to the path." At that time I was still young. I could not fully grasp his words. I only knew that from that day on, he began to eat less and less. Not out of ascetic pride, but because he wanted his body to no longer cling to the desires of taste. He withdrew into the forest, carrying only a bamboo tube of spring water, a few roots, and a small bundle of pine resin and lacquer seeds. Each day, he meditated beneath the old cedars, snow settling on his robe. There were nights when the wind froze me to the bone, yet he sat unmoving, still as the mountain itself. He taught me how to breathe. Not to breathe in order to live, but to breathe in order to let go. Once I asked him, "Master, are you not afraid?" He smiled, soft like wind brushing through cedar leaves. "Of course I am afraid. but I fear even more that a lifetime of practice would leave only a few verses behind and not a living example. He called that practice Mokujikigyo, the tree-eating discipline. No salt, no rice, no meat, no milk, only roots and resin. Then one day, he told me, the time has come. We dug a small chamber at the foot of the mountain. Not deep, just enough to sit. He stepped inside. I placed a small bell beside him. Each day, while you are still awake, ring the bell once. I nodded, my eyes lowered, unable to look at him. Then he closed the door. That evening I heard the first sound of the bell, faint, as if his hand only brushed the rim of the metal. The second day it rang again. The third day, still. But the fourth, silence. I waited. 5 days, 10 days, a month, until one winter morning I opened the chamber. He was still there, posture unchanged, his body dried like wood, yet without odor. Only the faint scent of pine resin drifting in the air. I did not cry, nor did I bow. I simply stood there for a long time and asked myself, was this death, or was it continuation? Later, people would call such practitioners Sokushinbutsu, those who purified body and mind so completely that even the body no longer sought to decay. But to me, he was not a mummy, nor a saint. He was simply my master, a man who kept his vow to the end, even when the price was his very body. Between numbers, silence, and the things we still don't know, sometimes even science comes to the edge of itself. It walks slowly, with glass slides in hand and instruments sharpened with precision, but when it reaches a certain kind of stillness, it pauses. It doesn't always know how to ask the right questions. And even when it does, the answers don't always come. Take, for instance, the case of Dashi Dorjo Itigilov, a monk from the frozen lands of Buryatia. His body was exhumed in 2002 after resting for decades in meditation. No preservatives, no embalming, no refrigeration, and yet his skin remained soft, the joints still flexible, some tissues still elastic, as if the body had simply paused, not passed. A team of scientists examined him. They measured, documented, tested. But what they found was not a formula, only a quiet bewilderment. Of course, there are theories. Some speak of anaerobic environments, soil-rich in natural antibiotics, low temperatures that delay decay. Others compare it to the ancient mummification of Egypt, where salt and resins drew out the moisture of death. But here there were no such rituals. No salt, no chemicals, no human hand intervening. Only a monk, still seated, as if waiting for a conversation that no one else could hear. And so the scientists too fell silent. They had the tools to measure, but not to understand. They could describe the body, but not the vow that kept it intact. Maybe the question is not just how it happened, but why it matters at all. Perhaps it is not the preservation of the body that truly astonishes, but the invisible will that chose stillness so complete it left time itself unsure of what to do. Maybe that's where science ends and something softer begins. Not faith, not dogma, but a quiet reverence for the things that don't need to be solved, to be meaningful. And so we sit with questions that don't demand answers. We look through microscopes, we record data, we trace the contours of things we don't fully grasp. But at the end of it all, perhaps the most truthful thing we can say is, maybe science has not yet found the right words. But sometimes silence itself becomes the message. There are things not meant to be analyzed, but simply listened to. Some stories are not told aloud. They are passed down in hushed voices, shared only between those who know how to listen to what has no sound. When science reaches its boundary, when the body no longer responds to tools or measurement, something else begins to speak. Not in data, but in echoes. People say that after a monk enters his final meditation, the wooden fish drum keeps sounding in his sealed chamber. They say it doesn't stop for days, even when no one is inside. No one knows why. but no one dares to ignore it either. In another tale, they say that when the coffin was opened decades later, fresh red blood still flowed from the monk's body. The scent of lotus lingered in the room. No one could explain it, so they simply bowed. There are those who say that even after half a century, a monk's eyelids flutter open for just a breath, not to look at the world, but as if he's still meditating, somewhere between stillness and return. There are slippers left by a temple door. They belong to someone who hasn't been seen in 40 years. Yet every morning, a young monk sweeps around them, never moving them, never asking why, because some absences feel like presents. There are teacups filled at dawn for those who do not come. There are beds no one dares to remake. There are names that are never spoken aloud, but linger like the faint trace of incense in an empty hall. No one tries to prove these things. No one writes them down in a report. But they stay, like a bell that has been struck and continues to hum long after the sound has left. Maybe none of this is meant to be believed. Or maybe belief is too small a word for something that lives only in silence. Because there are some stories that are not about being true or false, but about how quietly the heart listens when it hears the sacred walking softly through the world. There is a strange kind of silence that often arrives after the story ends. Not satisfaction, not regret, but a quiet space, as if something still lingers, and yet does not need to be said. We've just walked through a journey, not to reach a conclusion, but to walk deeper into ourselves. Perhaps you listen to these stories with doubt, or with belief, or maybe with both. But whatever it was, now that all the sounds have faded, and even the imagined wooden gong no longer echoes, one question still remains. Light as a breath, floating on still water, what do we believe when no answers remain? No one demands that you believe in the extraordinary. No faith insists you nod in reverence at an incorruptible body. There is no teacher behind the curtain, waiting to deliver a final truth. There is only you, the one who quietly listened from beginning to end, sitting here now, with a breath just deep enough and a heart not quite closed. I didn't come to offer a truth. I only sat beside you, in that space where science has said all it can, and the whispers have faded into morning mist. I sit here, not to explain the incorruptible, but to simply look back and ask what truly remains after all that has been shared. Not relics, not tissue still elastic under the scalpel, not a prophecy fulfilled, but something smaller and far deeper, a vow never closed, a lamp that has not gone out. Somewhere, a young traveler once stood before a monk's unmoving body and didn't know whether to bow or just breathe. Somewhere else, a dry leaf lay untouched in the middle of a rainstorm, and people stepped around it without knowing why. And somewhere, perhaps even now, a wooden gong still sounds, though no one strikes it. These are not things you explain. They are things you feel in the stillness between two thoughts, or in that quiet moment before you fall asleep. When all the logic fades and all the rituals blur, we are left only with this. If this body of mine disappears tomorrow, what will remain? Is it the miracle that a body does not decay? Or is it the miracle that someone still chooses to sit down every morning and not abandon what matters most? Let us be honest. Most of us won't become relics. Most of us won't be found 100 years from now, still seated, still whole. But we will leave something. Always. A way we looked at someone and made them feel seen. A single choice made in silence that turned us from harm. A pain endured without blame. Maybe that's the vow that never truly ends. We started with questions, and we end not with answers, but with listening. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be lived with. And perhaps the incorruptible is not a miracle of preservation, but a lesson in presence. Not something to prove, but something to bow to softly. So now, as you sit here with me, not at the beginning, nor quite at the end, I will not ask what you believe. I will only ask, how deeply do you listen to your own body each day? And if you were to make a vow, just one, in this fleeting moment of breath and bone, what would it be? A miracle or microbiology? Perhaps that's not the real question. The real question is, can we live as though nothing is too small to matter? Can we pause long enough to notice the soft places in us that still respond to silence? That is where I'll leave you. Not with an answer. Not even with an echo. Just a stillness. And perhaps the faint glow of a lamp that has not gone out.